So I want to make this guide simply due to the fact that we don't really have any existing resources anymore for playing Smuggler in PvP on Legends. And I've come across a lot of players who are struggling to make a start in a profession due to this. Most of the information in this guide will be built upon previous resources, discussions with other experienced players on the profession, and of course my own experience as well. This will ensure that the information is more up to date and representative of the game today. I'll start by going over the basics such as the prerequisites and recommended equipment, and then delve into ability and expertise explanations before discussing the specific gameplay. I did mention prerequisites, and that's because I'd recommend doing this before you do anything else in Smuggler. The Master Underworld Smuggler system is unique to Smugglers, and it gives you various bonuses once you reach a certain amount of faction points. I'm not going to go over this in too much detail, as there are actually existing resources for this, such as on the Legends wiki, but the main thing is to make sure you've collected all the bonuses. All the bonuses are overrideable 608 armor, an extra 3 weapon damage, and an extra 3 meters of range. You should also have access to illegal weapon modules as well, so make sure you have plenty of those. Once you have that done, the next thing to look at is your basic equipment. So for your heroic jewelry set, you're going to want to run the rogue set. This is essentially what gives Smuggler heaps of value in PvP due to the fact it allows concussion shot to apply the die snare debuff. I'll talk about that a little bit later though, and I would recommend getting this set before you jump into PvP, otherwise you probably won't enjoy yourself. And the next thing we're going to look at is armor and attachments. So this will depend on your expertise, because you might want to run Cybernex if you're running hidden padding and line pockets, but that's something I'm going to talk about a bit later when I actually cover that in the expertise section. So some things that will remain the same however, which is that you will run previous layered battle armor for the simplicity of balancing armor values, a socketed shirt, a personal shield generator, and a statted backpack. Make sure both the armor chest piece and the shirt have a socket baked in stat, which should be pistol damage in the case of Smuggler. So then with that, we're going to take a look at attachments. So there are two types of attachments, which are generally referred to as either 35s or exotics. But for your 35 attachments, you're going to want to run Constitution, Agility and Luck. And the reason we go for these stats is because Smuggler is inherently quite a squishy profession, and you're primarily going to need this to bolster your defensive stats. Luck's quite a well-rounded stat however though, and it does give a lot of bonuses with the addition of interacting with certain Smuggler abilities like Skullduggery and Impossible Odds. Some people also do like to throw a little bit of strength in their 35 as well, just to balance out their hit chance. If you're a newer player and you want to actually familiarise yourself with what these stats actually do, I would recommend looking on the Legends wiki, particularly on these pages here, as these will give you a lot of in-depth information about what they actually do. So for your exotic attachments which go into your shirt and chest, you're generally going to want to run pistol damage, pistol crit, and either generic crit or PvP crit. Some people do recommend having a secondary set for solo play which would have ACR on them, but I never particularly found action to be an issue in these scenarios, so I've personally never felt the need to use them. And the next thing to talk about will be weapons. So there's a few options here depending on what you're trying to do. So of course, if you're playing ranged, you're going to want to use a pistol, and the current DPS cap for these on Legends is 1170. And through various weapon updates, most crafted weapons are able to reach the same DPS value and range, so you don't need to look for specific ones. Just make sure that any pistol you do buy has pistol damage baked into it, and I would generally recommend running the heat element on your primary weapon, especially if it's your first one. And the reason I say to get a heat weapon as your main weapon is because the heat elemental proc doesn't cause a recourse like the other elemental procs do, which is something that's important to know in group play. As an example, generally your commandos will be running a cold heavy weapon, and that elemental debuff increases damage taken by the target. The percentage of damage taken is determined by the amount of elemental damage on a weapon, which is low on a pistol but high on a heavy weapon. That means that you'd want to leave this element for the commandos to apply because they'll be getting more value out of it. Even if you were to use acid or electric, these debuffs would still place a recourse on the target, which prevents all other elemental debuffs from applying until it runs out, with the exception of heat. And with that being said, if you're playing solo or without commandos, acid is definitely a viable option that works well, especially in some matchups compared to others. The acid elemental proc will place a debuff on the target, which provides 75% increased crit to all attackers. So if you end up timing this well with laying a burst, it can definitely be very potent. Of course, heat still works well for this purpose too, but eventually you'll likely want to have options. And the other thing you're going to want to get is a weapon called the Smuggler's Black Hand Annihilator. So this is a weapon that's loot from space convoys, but it is tradable, and the entire purpose of it is just to provide you with a 60 meter range weapon, 64 when you factor in your range bonuses. This is something that will be crucial to have in PvP, especially in battlefields, as it will still allow you to get off your single target abilities and die snares from the same range as our professions. You will have to get used to swapping between your Black Hand and your main pistol though, depending on your range, otherwise you might be suffering quite a substantial DPS loss. And finally, there's also the topic of melee weapons. These can be something you can get later on, but these can be good to have in a bag, especially if you're running pistol whipping your expertise, and you'll basically just swap to it before you use the pistol whip and increase the amount of damage you put out during it. Even without any points invested into melee, you'll find that you'll sometimes be able to just completely full health some players doing this, but this will be a topic for later when we look at the expertise in full. Due to melee weapons having a bit higher elemental damage, you can use cold for these, but acid works perfectly fine as well. So next I'm going to talk about consumables. There's not really too much to say in the way of food. Generally you'll want to use a carragum if you're running solo or without a J officer, since they'll be providing runs. If you do have them in your group, then you'll want to run Breath of Heaven. This will help with your survivability due to the constitution and dodge it gives you. And for secondary food, I generally run Iphorian Mist, which provides fire resistance and absorption, which generally works out to be the best option. And for power-ups, you'll want to use pistol damage times 3. And as for your entertainer buff, this will depend quite a bit on what build you're using and what you're trying to do, but the general rule I found I have of it is that this should comprise of mostly defensive values depending on your build. So if you're running any armor, you'll probably want something like constitution and critical hit defense in there, or if you're running no armoring expertise, then you'll want to max out your kinetic and energy armors with constitution and perhaps some elemental resistance. It's best to feel this out and find where you feel you're lacking when you're playing. You may be able to pick up some more offensive options such as crit if you're finding that your ability to survive is good enough, but yeah, there's a lot of different options, so I'd recommend just feeling it out, playing and making adjustments as you go. Before I talk about expertise, I'm going to go over the functions of the various base class abilities. So let's start with the basic single target attacks. These will be fast draw, concussion shot and bleed. For fast draw, there's not a whole lot to say as it's just your quick attack with a low cooldown, and for the most part this will be your spam the ability just to put out some damage. As for concussion shot, this is a pretty important one. So this will primarily be used for the snare debuff it has. The base ability has a 14-second snare at the max rank, but when you're using the Rogue's 5-piece set we talked about earlier, this will become the die snare debuff. So a die snare is essentially a snare that cannot be removed, and it will always land on the enemy provided that they are not already under the die snare recourse. This means that the debuff will even land for abilities such as a bounty hunter's presence and a medic stasis, and any kind of snare break or movement ability won't break it, so anything like a bounty hunter's power assisted sprint or Jedi's force run or even officer runs. So overall it's a very powerful tool to have for assist calling in a group setting to isolate targets out of position. And the last basic ability I want to talk about here is bleed, and what this does is it applies a bleed debuff on the target which deals damage over time. You want to keep this refreshed at all times and make sure you always have this active, just otherwise you're losing out on DPS. And with that being said, of course the ability itself does do on hit damage as well, so don't feel like you should only be using it when your bleed's about to drop off. And then moving on from that, we're going to look at the two main AoE abilities, which are fan shot and cover fire. So both of these abilities are your largest hitting abilities, with cover fire being the highest out of the two, and it also has an added snare on top of the damage as well. One thing to remember with both of these abilities is that they are a cone, so when you're picking out your targets in an AoE situation, you want to think about positioning and how to catch as many people in the cone as possible. So it may mean switching targets in order to just make sure you're maximizing the use out of these abilities. And the other thing to remember with both of your AoEs is that they are locked to 46 meters as the maximum range, so even if you're using something like a Black Hand Annihilator, you'll need to be within range to actually fire it off. And just to briefly add on about the melee abilities, if you look closely at these you'll see that they're essentially just mirrors of the ranged abilities in terms of the functionality. So for example you can look at them and see that Precision Strike is the same as Fast Draw, Concussion Shot is the same as Dizzy, Bleed is the same as Crush, etc. But the only one thing to note is that Brawler Swipe is actually the highest damage attack here, so that's the one thing that does vary a little bit. So then moving into the other abilities, which are more sort of utilities and buffs, we do have some more to talk about. So the first ability I want to talk about here is Camouflage Ally. This one has numerous ways it can be utilised effectively, as it essentially allows you to cloak an ally and place them into stealth whilst making them drop combat too. The primary use you're probably going to get out of it is going to be using it on your bounty hunters in order to assist them with their trap pushes, but you can also use it to prevent deaths as sort of like a defensive cooldown as well. So for example you can use it on an incapacitated player in order to delay them being death blowed, and it may give them enough time to get back up, or if you have someone getting caught out in a bad spot by CC, maybe they got die snared or die trapped in a bad place and they're probably likely to die, you could also use it to try and buy them an extra few seconds to live and potentially recover. So once you get used to using this ability, it's definitely something that can come in clutch. And the next ability I want to talk about is the Self Heal. I'd say this is pretty much self-explanatory. It's just your basic 15-second cooldown and 3.5k heal, and yeah, that's all there is to it. And then we have Dirty Trick. So this is an ability that you can drop at your feet. It persists for around 6 seconds and provides a 16-second snare debuff on an enemy that steps within the radius. So this is a very potent snare ability that will be very valuable, particularly in 1v1s or solo gameplay, and it can be fairly easy to bait enemies into it. There's a cool trick you can do with it in order to root enemies, but I'll talk about that a bit later in the expertise section. And then one of the last abilities we're going to talk about from your base abilities is Call a Favor. So the non-expertise version of this ability calls out a Smuggler NPC, and it will attack enemies for up to 60 seconds or until it's killed or combat ends. And this is purely just going to result in some extra DPS, but you can also use it, for example, to keep someone in combat if they're trying to run away. But one thing to note is that its health is fairly low, so it can be killed fairly easily. And lastly, I should also talk about Modify Weapon just quickly, just because it's important. So this ability is how you apply your illegal weapon modules from either the Master Underworld Smuggler missions or Convoy drops, depending on how you decide to get them. And it gives you a 30-minute buff that provides 12% extra weapon damage. So this is something you're always going to make sure you're using if you're doing any sort of combat content. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about expertise. This will be quite a big section. So I'll start this off just by going through all the various options, going vertically on each page, and then providing some templates at the end as well. I think it's important to understand what each ability does, rather than just copy and pasting a template without sort of any knowledge about why certain things are good or how to use them. So that's why I want to just include all the information about all the options in here as well. So starting on the left of the Scoundrel page, I'm going to talk about Spot Sucker. So this was fixed on Legends. It is a very powerful debuff, especially when you invest in the full line. The first point will only be a precision debuff with the rank 4 ability giving the target negative 100 precision. The next point, as you can see, will give them 50% less crit chance. The box after that will give their attacks 50% extra chance to be a glancing blow, and the last 2 points will give them a 25% damage decrease, which totals at 50% with both points. As you can see, if you have the entire line here, you can almost totally shut down an enemy once this is on them. An important thing to note as well is that this can't be removed by normal means, such as medics boosting it off or obviously using synaptic stim. It also can't miss, and it has a 45-second cooldown with a 12-second duration. So this is absolutely great to throw on something like an officer who has SFP up, or a commander that's pushing you down fast, or even another smuggler that's fully proccing. And in a 1v1 scenario, this is probably the closest thing you'll ever have to a real defensive cooldown. But yeah, due to all the points I mentioned, this is something I would nearly always recommend running in expertise. But one thing to note as well is that the only difference between rank 1 and rank 4 of the debuff is the amount of precision it reduces. Rank 1 gives you negative 10 precision, and rank 4 is negative 100. So it's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about action conservation, as you can use the lower ranks due to the lower action cost, and you'll basically get the same debuff, it'll just be slightly less on the precision. Next we're going to look at hidden padding and line pockets. There's a little bit to talk about with this one, but essentially what it does is it grants you an amount of innate armor which is overrideable, and it diminishes by 1 point per 2 points of regular armor. So what happens is, with no armor equipped, you'd be at 5900 kinetic energy, plus the 600 from us, so you'd end up at 6500. With a full suit of cat battle armor, you'd then get to 9800 kin any and 9200 elementals. And this is because of what's talked about in the tooltip, where the innate armor diminishes by 1 point per 2 points of regular armor, so it effectively halves all other sources of armor gains. But what some people do to make up for this is run cybernetics. So these have a lower armor value, but they can be crafted with a health bonus, and it gives you a total of 1350 health if you have all the pieces equipped. So with everything equipped and a full set of cybernetics and a regular helmet, you'd be at around 9.3k kin any and 8.7k elementals, which is of course a bit lower, but you'd have the extra 1350 health bonus from these as well. Since your bonus from any armors in your entertainer buff will also be halved, you can make up for that just by replacing it with constitution. This means that you're effectively trading armor value for more health, and it does technically work out better when you're just comparing the stats against each other. You can also drop the chest piece and run regular armor, which would get you to around 9.5k kin any and almost 9k elementals, but you'd be losing out on the full 50 health from the cybernetic piece. This would also give you the advantage of allowing yourself to swap out exotics as well, without having to go to a cybernetic specialist, which can be annoying. Also, math with these boxes means that you should technically be a little tankier. I personally don't actually feel a difference whether I have them or not. Not using them does allow you to gain an extra 2 expertise points, which can go a long way in the Smuggler expertise. It does mean you have to make up for this with armors in your int buff, but I personally feel like I gain a lot more value from those extra expertise points. It also allows you to gain the full bonuses from other buffs that provide regular armor, such as Legendary Warrior, which will be active a lot in group PvP. Just for a little comparison, without these boxes you can get to around 10.3k in any of battle armors and armors ingredient buff, but you will be lacking the elementals. Now that leads me to something I have thought about recently with the BH changes that gave them an elemental armor break, and whether it could potentially make these boxes a lot more valuable, but this isn't something I've really tested. The armor break is percentage based as well, and there are still plenty of BHs running rifle builds. And the next thing we'll talk about is Narrow Escape. So this ability has a 30-second cooldown, and what it does is it breaks any regular snares, as well as it provides a brief period of snare immunity while the buff is active, and it also does provide a slight movement buff on top of that as well. This is of course is vital if you're playing solo or without officers, but if you solely only log in for group PvP, such as battlefields, it's something you could potentially drop. I personally still like to run it all the time, just because maybe I don't trust officers as much as other people do, but it is something to consider at the least. So next up is Hammer Fanning and Break the Deal. So generally you'll either decide between putting points into here or Spot Sucker, but as you can see we'll start with Hammer Fanning, and what it does is it gives you a passive chance of 5% per point to shoot twice per second with a pistol, going up to a maximum of 20% with 4 points into it. And this does account for weapon speed as well, so it will actually be a bit lower. But when you move down to Break the Deal, it does tend to run into some problems when you're weighing up against Spot Sucker. So they have the same cooldown, but Break the Deal only has a 4-second duration. So of course the 75% damage reduction is very strong, but I find that the duration makes it feel comparably weak. Whilst Hammer Fanning is of course a nice DPS increase, I do feel like I miss out too much on any sort of group and defensive value when I take this instead of Spot Sucker. And the other thing to keep in mind of course as well is that Break the Deal can be boosted off by Medic, and an officer can remove it on themselves as well, so that's another thing that sort of makes it weak in comparison to Spot Sucker. And in the last line here we have Off the Cuff and End of the Line. So these are two real core abilities in your expertise, as it's what partially gives Smuggler its high burst potential. As you can see, Off the Cuff will make your next ability critical, while End of the Line will make your next critical deal double damage. So you can imagine you pair these together, you use it with something like Cover Fire as your strongest hitting AoE, and you can definitely get crits, you know, over 12k, I've seen 30k, nearly 14k. But yeah, so this is something you're always going to want to take in your expertise. One of the other things to point out here is Double Deal. As you can see, it gives you a chance when you're using Off the Cuff to instantly reset the cooldown. So you'll see sometimes that you use Off the Cuff, you'll get a proc that says Double Deal, and you will basically get your Off the Cuff back instantly. And there's no sort of like recourse on this, so you can, if you're lucky, keep chaining these resets. And at the very end of this line we have Nerf Herder. So what this is an AoE route which applies on your next crit. So you can obviously combine this with Off the Cuff, which we talked about earlier, to guarantee a crit, and then you can either use an AoE like Fan Shot or Cover Fire as your AoE ability to get an AoE route onto an entire group. One thing to note is that the General's Airstrike, the GCW ability, will also play Nerf Herder and is affected by Off the Cuff, so that's also another way you can use it as well. One thing to remember is that it's not a dire route, so you have to look for, in group PvP, you're going to have to look for the windows when the enemy group doesn't have a scatter up, in order to get the most use out of it. Even being able to land a route for a couple seconds between officers rotating their runs can definitely typify against them. So another way you can get use out of Nerf Herder is with Dirty Trick, like I mentioned earlier. So what you do is you use Dirty Trick, then Off the Cuff, which makes it crit, and then you use Nerf Herder. So of course, because it's going to make the Dirty Trick crit, it will fire off the Nerf Herder once an enemy steps within its radius. So this is something that's very useful for getting off routes when you're behind LOS, especially in solo scenarios. For example, you're running away, you go behind a wall, you can drop it on the other side to help yourself get away, so it's a very good skill to have. You can also do it to find spies in stealth as well, so if you drop it on the ground, they run over it and the same thing happens, so you'll also see when it fires off, so you might be able to tell where they are. You can also do this without nerf as well on battlefields, and it might help you see where any bounty hunters are. So moving on to the second page, let's start with Skullduggery. So this is something that was believed to be broken for a long time, but it had a misleading description which has now been updated on Legends as of a few years ago. There is a thread on the Legends forums called "Is Skullduggery Bad? Probably Not?", in which some testing was done with the ability, and there were some results which showed that the debuff was effectively reducing the hit chance of the target. As you should be able to see in the tooltip now, it states that it decreases the target's chance to hit based on a percentage of the Smuggler's luck, with the extra boxes increasing the miss chance further and the duration. I have done some testing of it myself though, and even though it does seem to be working, I haven't really seen enough noticeable value in it compared to the other places these points can be spent. So personally, I don't really think this is worth all the point investment. And that does bring us to the next debuff though, which is impossible odds. So this one was broken, but it has been fixed and changed on Legends. This debuff works by reducing the defensive rolls of the enemy depending on your character's luck value, with the extra boxes increasing duration and defensive reductions. It's hard to figure out the specifics, but from testing it seems to total around about a 30% strip to defensive rolls when you have 1000 luck, and that's split across all the rolls that it's stripping. So this absolutely is an option worth considering, as the debuff with extra points invested is definitely very potent in group and solo scenarios. If you are in a group setting, throwing this on the assist target can absolutely make a huge difference, and generally weighing your options here, you'll be weighing this probably against pistol whip. So if you spend a lot of time doing group PvP, I think investing full points into this is worthwhile. And that brings us to the ability I just mentioned, which is pistol whip. So this is an ability that doesn't really do anything significant by itself, but once you pick up the 2 flying tackle boxes, this becomes a 2-second stun. So stuns are a bit weirdly defined in this game, as there are a few different types of stuns, but this is one I would call a true stun in the sense that it makes a target unable to move or use abilities, and it also strips defenses for the duration. So this of course is a very strong ability, one I used for a long time. This does particularly shine in 1v1 or solo scenarios, as it can be hard to find a good opportunity to use it to be within enough range within group PvP. However, once you do get it off, it's entirely possible to full health someone in the 2-second window when you use it correctly. I personally swap to a melee weapon just before I get the whip off, as you have to be in melee range anyway, and it just maximises your output during it. Some people like to say that pistol whip should only be used as a defensive ability since you put yourself at risk by putting yourself in melee range, but this is definitely incorrect as a blanket statement, and the key is really just being smart of how you use it. One thing you should always try to do with it is use off the cuff before using it, as this should almost guarantee it will land. The last thing you'd obviously want to do is put yourself up in melee range just for the ability to miss. I generally don't think the extended duration is worthwhile unless you're doing some sort of cheesy melee build, as the 2-second duration should be generally long enough for you to get all your damage out anyway. So moving on from that, we're going to take a look at the Feeling Lucky line. So this is a little bit of a strange one to figure out from the tooltip, since it doesn't really say what it does, but essentially it works as a series of procs. So this means that on hits, you'll have a 1% chance per point to proc the first buff called Feeling Lucky, which grants 100 luck. When Feeling Lucky is active, you then have a 1% chance per point to proc Lucky Break, which grants 100% critical chance for 10 seconds. Then once Lucky Break and Feeling Lucky are active, you have a 10% chance per point to proc Card Up Your Sleeve, which grants double attacking. Once you're lucky enough to get all this going, your DPS output is just going to go completely through the roof. I'd say that this is a crucial line for Smuggler, as the damage output is completely unmatched when it does proc, but ultimately you are at the mercy of RNG in that regard. When Feeling Lucky drops off, it does have a 20-second recourse debuff, but if you're in a group, your medic should be able to clear that off for you. And after that, we're going to take a look at False Hope. So this goes back to what I said earlier, and that stuns have a weird sort of categorization in this game. This is considered a stun, but it functions differently to Pistol Whip, in that it roots the target in place, strips block and parry, and it applies a trivial hit debuff. However, it also is a ranged ability, and it works as an object that's thrown at the enemy. After a delay, the object explodes, which then applies a debuff at an 8 meter radius for 5 seconds. For a 1-point pick, this ability can be a very good option. The extra boxes reduce the delay and extended duration of the debuff by 1 second, which are also not a bad choice if you do want to fully invest into the ability. Due to the delay of the ability firing off though, I would recommend chaining it off an existing CC, such as Nerf Herder or a Die Trap, just to help you land it. Then moving along, we do have a Call a Favor Medic. So this upgrades the NPC summoned by the Call a Favor ability we talked about earlier into a Medic NPC that will sometimes heal you as well as attack enemies. It will generally get around 2 or 3 heals off per fight, and for a 1-point investment in the first row, it's not a bad pick to take. And lastly, we have Inside Information and Shoot First. So these abilities are essentially anti-bounty hunter abilities, so if you're planning to do a lot of solo PvP, these may be something to think about. So what Inside Information will do is reveal to yourself or other players whether they have a bounty or not. It won't say the specific amount anymore, but anything specified as a meager bounty will not appear on the boards, which is below 15k. It will also tell you whether you're being actively hunted or not, which is determined by whether the fact a bounty hunter is currently holding your mission. If the bounty hunter is within a specific range of you, it will also reveal how far away they currently are, and it will also identify if there's more than one. It's a pretty neat ability to have if you do like to engage in the bounty system and contest bounties, but the real worth from this line comes from Shoot First, which is linked to this ability. So Shoot First is a high single target damage attack with high action cost, but it also has a mechanic in that it will initiate combat against a bounty hunter if they are holding your mission. This means that you can essentially turn the tables up on a bounty hunter by attacking them before they attack you, and it often catches them completely off guard. It's a very fun ability and it does do very good single target damage. It's often being called a mini sniper shot. But if you're not really interested in the bounty hunter aspect of it, I don't think it's really worth the 2 points it costs. However, if you are just looking to do a lot of world and solo PvP, and you do enjoy the bounty hunter mechanic, I would consider this a good option. Just be mindful of the high action cost, but you could use the lower rank if you just want to use it to flag up an enemy bounty hunter. And even though it's not technically an ability, I feel like I should just talk about Blast at your side anyway, as it's a little bit confusing from the wording about what it actually does. So this essentially adds a flat bonus damage to all of your attacks based on 200% of your character level if you have both points invested, so that would be 180 if you're level 90, and it does factor in your weapon speed as well, so using a melee weapon with a speed of 1 will give you the 180 bonus, whereas a pistol with a speed of 0.4 would only give you 40% of the bonus. Either way, it's quite a significant DPS increase and I would always recommend taking it. So now I've actually explained all the key abilities and talked about the expertise a bit, I'll just say some general things to think about when it comes to actually making your choices. I generally feel that Spotter Sucker is an almost mandatory line to take and to go with the 4 point investment, since it's such just a powerful ability and it can somewhat make up for Smuggler's lack of defenses in a 1v1 scenario as well. And then when it comes to choosing whether to take armors or not, this is generally a preference. I've gone back and forth a few times between this myself, and I generally don't really notice much of a difference in survivability. The real thing you're sort of weighing out here is whether you want extra points in your amp buff or whether you want 2 extra points of expertise. I would stay away from certain boxes in almost every scenario though, such as Idiot Proof Plan, the Scan or Smooth Move lines, and the Junk Dealer line. These generally provide a pretty poor return for your points in comparison to the other choices. And moving on, we're going to talk about some gameplay. So when it comes to group PvP, a lot of Smuggler's value is going to primarily come from its dire snares that we talked about earlier. This is also what makes Smuggler the primary choice as an assist caller, since this CC enables you to keep targets out in the open, separate them from their group, and allow them to be focused down by the rest of the group. And without turning this too much into a sort of assist calling guide, I do think we need to just touch on that a little bit, because inevitably it's going to happen for a lot of people, especially if you do battlefields. So when you're fighting at range, you're generally going to want to swap to your Black Hand Annihilate that we talked about earlier, which will allow you to use some of your abilities from 64 meters. You're going to want to use LOS as much as possible and focus on getting dire snares for your group's assist. Obviously you're going to be throwing out your single target attacks and debuffs here too, such as Impossible Odds, which becomes very potent on the assist target if you're vested into that line. Just remember that if you do get caught in the open yourself, there's not much you can really do to survive without any defensive abilities, so you need to make sure you're staying as close to LOS as much as possible. It's also a good idea for the Smuggler to be the person that's keeping eyes out for the enemy bounty hunters, since you can also impede their push with your dire snare. Although if you are the person calling assist, it can sometimes be hard to juggle everything at once, so at the very least you should still be using a target macro for the enemy bounty hunter to stop them pushing as quickly as possible if someone else does call it out. And then when it comes to more close range fighting, such as when you're being pushed or pushing the enemy, you should always be swapping to your primary weapon just to make sure you're not losing out on a huge chunk of DPS from your Black Hand Annihilator. And this is where you're also going to be able to get opportunities to line up your big AoEs. One thing to think about with that is looking at the enemy's buffs and looking for their scatter to see if you're also able to go for a nerf herder. Generally, I look at the buffs, and if I see the scatter icon flashing, which means it has 10 or less seconds left, I'll try to hold off my off the cuff and cover fire to try and catch him in a window. This sounds simpler than it actually is though, since a lot of other things dependent on this, such as the enemy's position and the general sort of momentum of the fight. You might not always be allowed to get in range and get this off, so don't be expecting to catch every single charge window with a nerf herder. And of course, there'll also be times you won't really have a chance to even look for this. If it's a particularly intense fight and the opportunity comes up, getting the AoE damage out using your off the cuff and underlying cover fire, followed by Fang Shot, is of course important in itself for creating pressure and swing of momentum, so I don't feel like you should only be using it for during the charge windows and trying to catch them in a nerf. The other thing to talk about would be False Hope if you have it, which can pair nicely with other CC such as Nerf Herder or Die Traps, so that you can make sure everyone will get hit by the debuff, since False Hope does have a lot of value in just a trivial hit and block stripping portion of the debuff. And then another ability to talk about is Camouflage Ally and how to get use out of it. I did touch on this a little bit earlier, but this will require good communication and awareness to use effectively. So for an example, if you want your bounty hunter to go for a cloak push, they need to know that you're about to cloak them so that they don't immediately break it with ability, or that they're wasting time waiting for it when it's on cooldown. Awareness also comes into play when using it defensively, trying to save your teammates. As I said earlier, this can be great to save someone who's caught in a bad spot and they're likely to die, or to save someone who's incapped in order to prevent them from being deathblowed. If you get good at doing this, it's a very clutch thing to do and can absolutely save games. And then the other thing you want to be thinking about is how to best use Spotter Sucker. Using this properly is key to getting real use out of it. Some key targets to think about are usually enemy commandos, especially if they're pushing you with standfast, enemy officers who have popped SFP, enemy smugglers who are proccing. So this debuff is a pretty strong shutdown, and you should always communicate with your medics to make sure you don't overlap their stasis and Spotter Sucker. I always make sure to call out who I spotted, and I remind medics beforehand if I've not played with them much that when I do call out the spot on the target, don't stasis them. So I think ultimately the key thing that most people are going to have to get used to on Smuggler is the positioning, just due to how squishy it is. If you're not used to it, it can be very easy to get farmed, especially if you're used to playing other professions like Commando, which is a bit tankier, but when in doubt, just play conservative, play the range game, hide and pop out just to throw your die snares on opportune targets, throw out some single target damage and debuffs, then just wait for safer opportunities to get your AoEs going. So with all that being said, I think this is a good place to end off the guide. I know this has been focused more on sort of group PvP, but with solo PvP and 1v1s there's quite a lot of nuances there that I think would be quite hard to talk about on this kind of format. But if you do need to ask any questions at all, feel free to reach out on Discord or in the comments, and thanks for watching.
Great.
Hasher, let's split, look at him, kill Hasher. Kill Hasher and all their medics on the left. Zap back up, Zap target, Zap target. Gonna get a nerf out here. Nerf out, they're all fucking nerf. Kill Hack, kill Zap, Zap. They're all fucking dead if you push right now.
Contact. Great.
Talisman. Yeah.
You can get traps.
Yeah, sink. Got their one fucking officer here. He's dead. Asher. Don't shoot to get dead. Unnecessarily.
Great.
Yeah, still alive.
I'm gonna reverse on him.
Yeah, I'm gonna go through base.